We are in Glasgow, obviously. For those that are at home, we are welcoming you from COP26. Very excited about this event today. We have a few great panelists here. We'll get into that in a second. First, of course, we have to thank the Belgian government for giving us their time slot in the Benelux Pavilion. So we really appreciate that, getting this time slot for this youth-led event. Let's underscore that, youth-led, okay? You heard that, right? So what's to come in the next 70-ish minutes? You are going to be witnessing a beautiful dialogue on international law, climate justice, intergenerational equity, all these terms. And if you're freaking out right now because you don't know what it means, don't worry. We will take you by the hand and guide you through it as we go along. First of all, I'm going to introduce you to the panelists. Let me get my paper so I say everything right. On this side, we have the Honorable Saiyed-Khaiyum. Did I say that correctly?
Yep.
Correctly enough. Who has spearheaded efforts to modernize Fiji's laws in the key areas of domestic violence, corporate governance, and criminal code. And is also, as I believe, the Attorney General of Fiji and the Minister on Climate. Correct?
Yes.
All right. We're on the same page still. On his right-hand side, there is Ambassador Tevi, permanent representative of the Republic of Vanuatu to the United Nations since 2014, who just told me he misses the busy streets of New York. Apparently, Glasgow is not busy enough. So, very curious to see what that's like. One day, hopefully, when we're in the General Assembly next year, who knows? You have chaired many committees in the UN, but I'm sure the highlight of your career is being here with us today. Of course, we have to be a little bit cocky about ourselves. Then on this side, we have two youth representatives. One is Solomon Yeo from the Pacific Islands Students Fighting Climate Change, campaign director, and Julia Schnackenberg, which is a very German name, we know, who is part of the core team of World Youth for Climate Justice. We are going to get into what those two movements are, but first we are going to start with a video that will explain already the basics of what is an advisory opinion and why do we want this and why are we doing this campaign. So, can we start the video now?
Can you see?
I can see.
Year of the last decade, our world has seen greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise and shatter records. But those responsible for burning the most fossil fuels have not experienced the most direct consequences of climate change.
I cannot see the video.
The hundreds of millions of people living on the front line of the climate crisis. If global temperatures rise above 1.5 degrees Celsius in my lifetime, countries like mine will vanish beneath the waves. I will be forced to leave the land where my ancestors are buried, and to tell my children they have nowhere to call home. At Rio de Janeiro, Kyoto, and later at Paris, we were promised action, but despite ever more opportunities to address this crisis, the planet is hurtling towards climate catastrophe. Existing international agreements have not provided countries with legal clarity on their responsibilities to reduce emissions, leading to inaction. To break the impasse, the UN General Assembly must request an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on Climate Change and Human Rights. All it would take is a simple majority vote from UN member states. An advisory opinion is not legally binding but carries great legal and moral authority, encouraging all nations to protect the human rights of people affected by climate change. An opinion from the highest court in the world would also help to build a critical global coalition uniting governments and international institutions, and would define exactly what existing bodies of laws nations should follow. In the past, advisory opinions have been instrumental in establishing international laws on the right to self-determination, the prevention of genocide, and nuclear disarmament. We believe it could do the same for climate change. A planet in crisis doesn't have to be our future. If there is power in the world to save humanity from environmental disaster, it is the power of the people. But time is running out, and we have to act now. Please visit our website to join us.
All right. Very clear video, I would say. We can all leave now. End of discussion. No, jokes. We have one more video, which is the opening of this session by the Minister on Climate Change of Belgium. As I said, we are using the Belgian time slot in this Benelux pavilion, which we share in between Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, of course. So we have one more video message before we actually start getting into depth about this.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it is important that we address climate change and the biodiversity crisis within the broader context of sustainable development and the ambition to leave no one behind. I commend the tireless efforts of many young people to remind us of the dire consequences for individuals and communities often vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. The Paris Agreement, a milestone in many perspectives, was the first multilateral environmental agreement that makes a direct link to human rights. It also acknowledged climate change as a common concern of humankind. Climate change is indeed a threat multiplier and it knows no borders. It interacts with other risks and threats, which can take many forms. Droughts, floods, and failed harvests can lead to a volatile food crisis, food shortages, and political upheaval. It can exacerbate poverty, force people into unemployment, or even displacement. This will have knock-on effects on people's well-being and different forms of equality. We recognize that justice can be a powerful leverage for change. That's why we are working to include ecocide in our penal code. The side event will give renewed impetus to ensuring we live up to the Paris Agreement while respecting human rights, promoting intergenerational equity, and achieving sustainable development.
All right, great intervention or opening from the Belgian Minister on Climate Change. Solomon, we are going to start with you. Yes, you are, if that's okay with you.
That's fine.
All right, because we are here because Pacific Island students fighting climate change and World Youth for Climate Justice, we thought this is great, we can do an event. But why are we here? Why did the Pacific Island students fighting climate change start this campaign, and how did it start? What can you tell us about that?
Thank you, Dennis. It's a question that it's a very funny question because it started like a school project, like a classroom project. We, in our final year of law school, we decided, hey, let's do something that we can do it. We can go out of this university and feel proud about it, you know. So we started like this school project together with 27 law students at the University of South Pacific. This was mostly at the University of South Pacific MLS campus, that's in Vanuatu, but also other members of us are coming in from the other campuses as well. So we got together from this, it's an international environmental law class that we all came together on. We decided, hey, let's do some research on how can we best utilize the law as a vehicle to bring about transformational change. So we've done some research, we've gone through some options that we have available, and we decided that the International Court of Justice advisory opinion was the one that it took our fancy, if I may say. So we've done a lot of research, put together draft documents, and then we decided, look, we need to get governments to support this, and we are standing on the soil of Vanuatu. Why don't we approach the Vanuatu government? So we got together, dressed up to the nines, and then went to the office of the government foreign affairs minister. We pitched the question. They said, thank you for the question. Even it took us only like 2 minutes So we consider this question, we'll think about it, and then we'll decide. So it was around March when we started this whole initiative, but it was also nearing what we have, which is called the Pacific Island Forum, which is the intergovernmental regional forums that we have in the Pacific. Equivalent, we're in the European Union, so we can say the EU equivalent. And this is where the 18-member country of the Pacific Island Forum will convene once a year to talk about matters that matters. So the government took this campaign forward. Vanuatu did put this toward the forum, and the leaders noted it positively in 2019. So we thought that was it. Like, oh, we did it. A project is complete. But knowing a little that we know, and little that we know, we should have been not doing this in the beginning, because it's going to lead to this whole new campaign and whole new movement and a lot of Google documents and a lot of virtual meetings and of course a lot of campaigning. But it didn't end it there. So we decided that for the campaign to be really successful, we really need to push the whole region, and also young people and civil society and citizens all across the world to understand why these campaigns needs to happen. So hence the Pacific students synergize with civil society. Some I can see their faces in this room as well. And thank you, Tomas, for coming to this event as well. And of course, this is where we build together the global voice, the regional voice and the campaign.
All right. There's one very specific thing that is at the core of this campaign, and you really want to stress as a youth movement that this is at the heart of this campaign, and this is a term called intergenerational equity. There might be people here that don't know what it means and why it's so important. Can you describe it?
Thank you, Dennis, for that question. I think intergenerational equity is why we're here today in this conference. Intergenerational equity is to ensure that, in my version of understanding it, is just to ensure that we utilize the resources of now, so that the future generations can also enjoy the resources, or even better, and thrive as well. So it's an idea that is closely related to sustainable development, as we all know. But intergenerational equity is understanding that the future generation has an interest also in the actions and conducts that we do here today at present. So at the moment, as we all know, the planet is not in a good state. It's because our actions are not in taking in due consideration of the future generation. Now, the principle of intergenerational equity is something that is core to the campaign, because through our research, we discovered that it has been well reflected in practice. South Africa has it in the constitution. Germany has it in the constitution to some degree. And also you have legislation that highlights this, state practices, international treaties, and also academic writings that mention consistently of intergenerational equity. But still, in international law, it's still vague. We need that clarity, that our rights of the current generation, young people who are in this room, who are out there in the world, in the Pacific Island, can ensure that their rights and the rights of their future generation, their children, our children, are be able to be protected and respected by our governments. And also, especially in the light of climate change, this is even more important.
And this is what the advisory opinion, of course, will bring.
Well, I can only speak for the youth here, and this is really in the core interest of the young people. Of course, climate change, I think no one in this room would disagree that the most people will suffer at the end of this is young people.
All right. Ambassador Tevi, you are representing the Vanuatu government in the UN. Recently, the Vanuatu government, I believe, proposed that they are going to bring this well, not this campaign, but your own campaign forward to request an advisory opinion. Why is it important for Vanuatu and other Pacific islands that such an advisory opinion is brought to the General Assembly?
Okay. Before I answer your question, I will have to go through my notes, and
of course,
because it's a broader topic.
No worries.
But first, let me just give you a brief background on what the other Pacific Islands did in the past. So in 2002, Tuvalu's Prime Minister announced that Tuvalu, Kiribati, and Maldives were considering swing suing some developed states before the ICJ as a result of their contribution to the sea level rise. A decade later, in February 2012, Palau's president gave a speech at the UN General Assembly announcing that Palau also planned to seek an advisory opinion on climate change before ICJ. It is therefore building on their efforts, the Pacific nations. In September of this year, our Prime Minister, Bob Lohman, decided that maybe Vanuatu can take the issue to the ICJ, but it has to go through the UN General Assembly's endorsement before it can go to ICJ. This announcement reflects an inclusive and thorough process followed within Vanuatu to build political momentum and capacity to advance the initiative. Some milestones in this process are the establishment in January of this year, a climate and loss damage legal task force, and in February, Vanuatu's National Advisory Board on Climate Change endorsed the initiative, therefore preparing the groundwork for the decision of the cabinet and the announcement of Vanuatu's Prime Minister. Vanuatu relied on the advice of the Pacific Law Firm, as well as a group of prominent experts on international law and climate change. And Vanuatu's initiative has deep and solid roots in Vanuatu and the aspirations of the region, and it has also been carefully considered and developed from a legal perspective. Now, Mr. Solomon has discussed the movement came from the grassroots, so I won't go into that because he explained that clearly. Now, the 50th Pacific Island Forum meeting noted the issue in one of the meetings at the 50th Pacific Island Forum, and I will read what they've noted. The PIF leaders singled out climate change as the single greatest threat to livelihoods, security, and well-being of the peoples of the Pacific, and recognizing the need to formally secure the future of our people in force of climate change and its impacts. They noted the proposal for UN General Assembly seeking an advisory opinion from ICJ on the obligation of states and the international law to protect the rights of present and future generations against the harmful effects of climate change. Now, the request made to the UN General Assembly, although previous efforts have encountered many hurdles in that way, Vanuatu is not deterred. Gathering the necessary support of the UN General Assembly will be challenging. That's what Vanuatu knows, that it will be challenging, and it is not an easy process. But this challenge is also what will ensure that the initiative is carried out by the aspirations of many peoples through the governments, and that the questions put to the court are shaped by those who endorse and support the initiative. In other words, I am seeing much like youth movements, the glass half full again, because it is only by building a dialogue and a movement at the global level that the request and the advisory opinion itself will enjoy sufficient legitimacy and command the necessary authority for it to be genuinely influential. Now, the moment is ripe. The context has fundamentally changed in the last decade, making it more propitious for the initiative. Now, first, small island developing nations and other climate vulnerable countries are no longer only ones clearly affected by climate change. These consequences are now being felt everywhere in the world, even in the most unexpected areas. They include sea level rise, desertification, and so forth. Secondly, climate litigation before domestic courts has very substantial developed, achieving results that many saw as out of reach a decade ago. Importantly, this body of litigation has developed in all corners of the world, developed and developing countries, and it has followed some unexpected pathways. I would like to emphasize that in most cases, domestic courts have simply applied classic legal concepts, such as the duty of care or human constitutional rights, which they have reinterpreted in the light of the radically different context of climate emergency. That is an important signal with respect to what a clarification effort by the ICJ could achieve. Thirdly, the economic and political equations are changing too. Today, a large number of countries have implemented or are considering green transformation packages to transition from a carbon-intensive to a low-carbon economy. The EU Green Deal is one of them. So what could an ICJ advisory opinion achieve? ICJ opinions command great authority. I think we've had
I heard Solomon about it, yes.
Yeah. In the past, they have to clarify the legal situation of major challenges such as the fight against apartheid, the right of peoples to self-determination, or the construction of a war-occupied Palestine territory. By clarifying in an authoritative manner the requirements of international law in high-stakes context in which UN bodies are unable to make progress at the necessary pace, advisory opinion can secure the legal rights of states, peoples, and individuals.
Perfect. Can we continue with your last part in the final? I will ask again, and then you can continue later. Is that okay?
Yeah, no problem.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much. I like how you in very similar words addressed intergenerational equity. Of course, we as youth, we're gonna remain very vocal about that. That should in fact be in there. But I like that you already mentioned it. We'll go to your fellow Pacific Islander, let's say, Honorable Mr. Aiyaz Saiyed-Khaiyum. I would like to ask you how can national legislation benefit and perhaps even be strengthened by such an ICJ advisory opinion on climate change as we have described?
No, thank you for that. I mean, it's quite relevant for the Fijian experience, if I could speak from that perspective. We had a new constitution that was implemented in 2013 that for the first time actually introduced both civil and political and socio-economic rights. I don't think you'll find many constitutions in the world that has both the civil and political and socio-economic rights. And these rights are two aspects to them. One, they are all justiciable. In other words, you can actually impose those rights or seek relief under those rights. And secondly, it applies both to the state and also the private sector. So it's not only what we call a vertical application of the right, which I think is quite significant. The other important point, of course, is that in our constitution, it says when the courts actually look at interpreting the various rights, of course, many jurisdictions, you actually have to develop the jurisprudence in those rights. Because, for example, we have a right to transportation. If you have not had those rights, then where do you get, if somebody seeks relief from the state, what are the common law principles or what conventions do you actually relate them to for the courts to actually make those rulings? So what is really significant, it says in our constitution, if I could read very briefly, in addition to complying with section 3, blah, 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 when interpreting and applying this chapter, which is the Bill of Rights chapter, a court, tribunal, or other authority, A, must promote the values that underlie a democratic society based on human dignity, equality, and freedom, and B, which is very relevant in this particular instance, may, if relevant, consider international law applicable to the protection of the rights and freedoms in this chapter. Now, under the gambit of international law, you could also look at, for example, an ICJ ruling. So that's where it becomes, relevant from that perspective. And I think the other point that I want to make, just talking about intergenerational equity, is in our constitution we have environmental rights too. So it says every person has the right to a clean and healthy environment, which includes the right to have the natural world protected for the benefit of present and future generations through legislative and other measures. Now, intergenerational, essentially, that's what it means. So where you have intergenerational equity between the current, population or current population and the future population. We are very proud of this. This is the Climate Change Act, one of the very few acts in the world that's specifically been drafted in relation to climate change. In this Climate Change Act itself, we have a particular provision here that says, Section 65, this act recognizes that climate change is a threat to the rights and freedoms recognized in Chapter 2 of the Constitution, and in particular, A, the right to a clean and healthy environment, B, the right to adequate food and water, C, the right to health, D, the rights of children and persons with disabilities, E, the right to housing and sanitation, and F, the right to reasonable access to transportation. So you can see they sink in quite well, given our constitutional provisions and what we have in respect to the Climate Change Act. And specifically to your question regarding how would such a ruling help, obviously it does give a form of guidance. Because for the local jurisdiction now, of course, you have people that can seek to enforce these rights. And they would argue and refer, for example, if you have a ruling that would go, in favor of what is being sought, they could obviously refer to that too.
What about the fact that, does it not matter then, your thoughts on that, that it's not legally binding?
Well, I think, as has been highlighted by His Excellency and also by our friend, that it seeks as a guidance. I mean, you'll find that many courts nowadays, particularly when there's a lack of jurisprudence, they would look at, various other conventions, norms, and of course, in this particular case, if you have a ruling or guidance from the International Court of Justice, people could refer to that. And the courts themselves, because they will have to develop the jurisprudence, would actually look at these, not necessarily legally binding decisions, but something as a point of reference.
Perfect. Anything else you would like to add?
Lots more, but I'll...
Okay, we'll get back to you. Thank you so much for that. Really clear example, description as well, on the Fijian case relating to this. Jule, you are a core member of World Suite for Climate Justice. What does that mean?
Thank you for the question. What does that mean? So Solomon and his colleagues and friends have done a great job. They started this. But as we heard, we need a UN General Assembly majority to get the court to consider this. So we need the world behind the Pacific Island students, behind Vanuatu, behind Pacific Islands in general. So we launched a global network of youth and civil society organizations trying to do exactly that, trying to rally global support, stand in solidarity, and advance intergenerational equity and climate justice at the highest court of the world.
And so we are all youth here. We're all campaigning in favor of the advisory opinion. We find governments that are willing to vote in favor of this. Then this is approved by or ratified by the General Assembly. What then? Does our role as youth end there?
No, I like to think that's actually where it starts. So the question will be negotiated in New York behind closed doors. That's what has happened in the past. It will be sent to The Hague. It's not, especially to young people, it's not clear how international law is made. What does that even mean? What is international law? So our expectation in this whole process is that we are a part of that. We are here today, and I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us, allow us to sit on the stage as equals, and we have the expectation that we continue this throughout the process until the judges will come out and deliver the advisory opinion. So states will be making statements, they can submit written submissions, they can plead there orally in person, and we demand that young people are a part of that, that our voices are heard, civil society organizations are heard in those written submissions and the oral submissions. We will be present in The Hague, so we will not be lying back once next year September comes around and the General Assembly approves this. But that's, I think, when we become even more important. We collectively, I say that, not just Solomon.
Perfect. And how is this campaign growing? How is the European campaign going? And maybe there's some young people here that want to get involved. What does that mean, getting involved? What can we do?
What can you do? Thank you for the question. Yeah, we are working in Europe and we are setting up an international network. Some of the people who have supported us in this process are here in the room today. We need your governments on board. If you're a government representative, then this is an invitation to join us, to go to The Hague. We really need your support in convincing governments that this is all in our collective interest. To fight for climate change and human rights, and really bringing these things together, that we're not asking for anything new, but something that's very obvious and very clear, and that we have an absolute right to demand as well. So a right to remedy, that's what we say.
All right, so nice. I would like to bring it back to Ambassador Tevi. One question for you. You mentioned already there have been attempts before, for example, by Palau, in a very similar bite to address the UN General Assembly. Why are you convinced that this time we can actually get this through the General Assembly?
Well, I think like I have mentioned, I think the moment is right. Now we have the Paris Agreement in place. We have a lot of scientific studies in place, and we have the youth movement and the people's movement around it. So I think the time is ripe, and we can take it there. But like I've said, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy. It is a challenge. It is a challenge because you need the General Assembly to endorse it. So you need the majority of the General Assembly. So that will be a political process. Yeah. So sometimes political process is messy, but that is something that we have to do it. So at my time at the UN, there were several resolutions that they were taken to the General Assembly, and they ended up at the ICJ. I think the Maris's case is one of them.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. I've been doing a lot of talking. Well, not really, but too much already. Anyone in the audience that thinks I have a very specific question for someone in the panel that would like to pose the question?
Just a question. This year, the UN Human Rights Council passed a resolution for the appointment of a special rapporteur on human rights and climate change. How do you see this factoring into this work?
So maybe I can just repeat it for the live stream. This year, the UN Human Rights Council appointed a special rapporteur on human rights and climate change. And how does this relate and affect this campaign, right? Okay. Would you like to answer?
I mean, obviously, I think it would complement it. The fact that you have the Human Rights Council now saying itself, directly or indirectly, that there is a linkage between climate change and human rights, and therefore they would have a special rapporteur, actually means that, it would feed very positively into that. Normally, rapporteurs are invited by states to come to their countries, and, for example, in this case, they would be looking at, assessing the linkage between climate change, the effects of climate change, and the human rights of those people of that particular state. But in fact, I wanted to go back to one question you had asked earlier on. What happens once you get this particular ruling from the court, a non-binding ruling? The issue about rights, obviously, is always about justiciability. Are those rights justiciable? And as you know, that we live in a global community, but that is still driven by sovereign states. And sovereign states obviously operate in their own jurisdictions. Of course, you have states that may sign international conventions, and those international conventions that normally get translated into local law, domestic legislation, and then become justiciable. Some, of course, if they sign the various protocols, then they are able to take those matters to the UN system. I think what would be useful once you get this particular ruling from the ICJ would be that if the youth, and I don't, frankly, I'm not necessarily somebody who believes in the dichotomous approach to climate change, the youth versus the older people. I think there needs to be this synergy as opposed to taking a dichotomous approach, because I think you automatically are then building barriers. But I think then those who are involved in this campaign should really then focus on getting domestic laws to be, developed, built up in relation to climate change. Of course, many would argue many jurisdictions in the world don't even have very robust human rights tenets or principles or laws. And they need to, of course, develop that. And within that framework, you can get climate change itself. So I think you have a lot of work to do. In particular, in many of the jurisdictions where you don't necessarily have the human rights laws built in, whether in the constitution or whether it's separate pieces of legislation, and to have the recognition that those human rights can also be affected by climate change. So, domestication of that would be critically important.
Yeah, Solomon, you wanna react on that?
I could not follow this, but maybe to bore the audience about, I'm recalling my law studies again. Yeah. When we do the research, we discover that we've noticed that the international environmental law and human rights law somehow have been developing separately. And because of that, we see the advisory opinion as some sort of like a connector, or it can bring towards the conversion of international environmental law and human rights law. And in that way, the combination would then define a new approach to addressing climate change, rather than from an environmental perspective or a human rights perspective, but as a nexus between the two in addressing this problem. Why is this very important? Because, of course, this human rights is not divorced from climate change and addressing climate change. In the Pacific, it's already clear. Our human rights is always is violated to new extremes now, and it's going to be and as the climate change exacerbates, so too the violation of our rights in the Pacific. Not those new rights like the socioeconomic rights, but just your basic human rights, like your right to water and sanitation, your right to food, your right to health. All that is coming under threat.
They are socioeconomic rights. Right to water, sanitation are socioeconomic rights. I mean, you can't say basic human rights. All rights, one would argue, is basic. But we've had this kind of dichotomous approach to rights, and people have argued whether rights are divisible or not, as we discussed the other day. Yeah. So most countries always focus on what they call traditional civil and political rights, your right to, when you're detained, etc. And then, of course, you have the other rights regarding transportation, economic participation, housing, health, etc. Now, if you look at climate change, one would argue that on the face of it, it really has an enormous and almost instantaneous effect on your socioeconomic rights. Your house is gone away, it's blown away, you don't have food, your traditional fishing grounds are gone. So you're affecting your you're affecting your socioeconomic rights itself. Your right to maybe detention is not affected by climate change immediately, but instantaneously it's affected in the socioeconomic space. So I think, we can't look at rights being divisible, but I think we also need to understand what are the sort of rights that instantly almost by climate change get affected or get infringed or breached. And I think it's critically important to understand that. And that's why I was saying you have to develop the human rights culture in many countries to be able for them to appreciate the linkage between climate change. And of course, we are saying that climate change has an impact on your rights itself.
Perfect. Anything you would like to add onto your colleagues' points?
Well, I don't have much to add, but all I can about his question, like the Attorney General and the Minister mentioned, it's complementary. I think the work will complement, and the international opinion will also provide clarity to some of the issues that he might be looking into.
We have one question in the back.
Win the majority at the UN General Assembly. I want to know the bottom line, the political possibility of which other countries are following Vanuatu. Is there a pioneer group of countries? What is the roadmap to actually get to win a majority?
All right, if I can just reiterate for the live stream. To get the majority, basically, which countries are on board already? And what do we need to do to get others on board?
Are there any northern countries
are there any northern countries on board? How
Well,
are you?
He's leading the campaign.
Yeah.
well, currently we've just started. I mean, firstly, we have to approach our region, our brothers and sisters in the region, to talk to them, especially the countries, and then we can talk to other countries. But I'm not going to go into detail in your questions, but there is a strategy and there is a way to approach it. Thank you.
All right, so it's too early to really determine these countries are on board already, but things are happening. You are working on it.
There is a process and protocol that we have to follow.
Of course, yeah. Jule, of course you can.
Yeah, I think as a youth movement, we have the expectation that there shouldn't be a reason why a country doesn't recognize the right for us to demand legal clarity, because no one benefits from a lack of legal clarity. So we are actively working on all parts of the world, knowing some countries will be more challenging than others. But if anyone has the energy to convince challenging countries to join us, I think it's us. So therefore, we are trying the whole world. Yeah, we're not just aiming for a simple majority. We want everyone on board.
Sorry? Have we made any wins as a youth movement? That is apart from the government. Any in the youth movement? Any wins? Has anyone said yes? Yes, we will be in favor.
Governments are interested in the campaign, of course, but to the young people, in convincing the government, we can also only raise what is in our best interest to the government. For the government, it is up to the government to make the decisions, and of course, intergovernmental relationships, like especially coming together with the Vanuatu government and deliberating on how can they go forward, whether this is a campaign that they would pursue that ultimately lies with the government level. What the young youth movement are doing is to show that this campaign matters to them, and this is the best interest of them, that governments should pursue their own respective government. So governments really need to consider that view and then speak together on whether they should pursue this or not.
Yeah. Do you feel like us as a youth movement, in that sense, are heard by these governments that we are addressing?
I hope so.
Because the question was, did anyone say yes? In order to be able to say yes, they need to hear us, of course. And as youth, we often face very different challenges than governments. Maybe we can describe a bit how that process works for us. Yeah, I put you on the spot.
Yes. Perhaps Yula?
For example, side events like this. Recently, so in order to just describe to you what kind of things we are trying to do to convince governments. A few weeks ago, we were actually in the Peace Palace with a side event, just an event. There was no side. And this is the strategy we take as youth. We try to organize events, try to mobilize other civil society groups. We also, in the Netherlands, for example, launched a coalition where other environmental groups, the local Greenpeace, Milieudefensie, these are all Dutch names, that were interested in the campaign, that are willing to look with us together. What can we do to bring it forward? So it's not just us as youth, because we have very specific challenges, but also larger civil society organizations that can help us reach the Dutch government, for example, in this case, or other governments in Europe. And hopefully, especially in the European Union, we are hoping to get a lot of members to vote in favor, and think that it might be able to become a domino effect if the European countries are happy with each other.
Yeah, I echo that passion, Dennis, because and now I recollect my thoughts.
Yeah, okay,
and this is what I'm saying. The campaign really started with 27 law students who were just counting coins to buy some sandwiches so that they can have a side event to launch their own initiative. And some of them, people are here. Professor David Foreman was here. He came all the way from Hawaii to support us in the cause in the earlier stages, because I think, as many people will see it, this is an idea that is ready. As Ambassador Tevis said, the time is ripe for this to happen. So in the region, we are doing a lot of work as well with the civil society. You have Brother Lorenzo there, who is from the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network, but also affiliated with the Vanuatu Climate Action Network. We have Solomon Island Climate Action Network. You have Kirikan, Kiribati Climate Action Network, and Tuvalu, Kiribati. So we have existing collaborative, like-minded civil society who have been, for the past 2 years in COVID time, even through COVID times, working together to form outcome documents, to hold side events, to raise awareness of what the advisory opinion is, and also what climate justice is. So this is a new trend, I would say, speaking for myself here, a new trend that is happening in the Pacific, that there's a rise and growing trend towards climate justice, which the heart of climate justice is human rights.
Perfect. Any more questions? Yes.
Just since I was mentioning in response to, I think that was a win at the Pacific Island Forum, getting the Pacific Island Forum nations to recognize that it wasn't necessarily this particular campaign, but you're building momentum.
Yes.
The discussion about human rights and the environment. Last month, the Human Rights Council voted unanimously, 4 countries abstained, to recognize a human right to a healthy environment. The youth movement here I see as similar to efforts with indigenous people. The northern countries were not supportive of efforts to recognize the rights of indigenous people, but that you focused on the developing nations and got enough support there. So there are roadmaps, and I'm sure His Excellency from Vanuatu is building upon that roadmap. So it's really exciting to see the youth, and I just wanted to make that.
Just to summarize for the live stream, I cannot do justice to your answer, but basically you are our fan, right? That's great. We have a question in the back as well.
My question is, we have a lot of Pacific Island governments in this conference talking about human rights. My question is to the governments, what are your human rights records like? And how is that going to be any different in terms of the climate change narrative? The human rights record has many shortfalls.
All right. So, question, please stay here if I do it wrong. Yes, to the Fijian government specifically? Okay, well, either one. Given that there's many Pacific Island states here present, and we are talking about human rights, what are your specific country records on human rights, which, according to you, were not great always? And how is this going to change with this? Do you understand the question?
Yeah, sure. There's not that many Pacific Island countries here, actually. There are 3 heads of government. There's only 3 of them. Unfortunately, we weren't able to have all of them here, of course, because of COVID restrictions and quarantine, etc. I think the reality is that we need to be able to not dwell in the past, but obviously learn from the past. I can talk about the human rights experience in Australia and New Zealand and Europe, USA, how they dealt with peoples or indigenous peoples, etc. And many countries have various breaches by the police, etc. But I think the point is that what do we have now? What laws do we have in place now? Specifically in Fiji's case, of course, we have a new constitution. Like I said, we have a very vast array of rights that are justiciable now, both vertically and horizontally. And we need to develop the jurisprudence on those rights. So I think, it's a very positive space. And the fact of the matter is that, we obviously are inviting people to participate. The fact that you invite rapporteurs to come to your country to assess your rights. So I think, as far as the climate change space is concerned and your ability to, and how it intertwines with human rights, that's something obviously we need to develop. And as I said again, the global system, whilst we have a global family, even if you look at these COP negotiations, they're all driven by sovereign states. That's how the system actually works. So similarly, jurisprudence along those lines are developed domestically. Domestic development of jurisprudence has, depending on the different state, they can actually, seek out jurisprudence that's developed offshore, whether it's through international convention, whether it's ICJ, whether it's something in The Hague, whether it's in the UN Convention system, Human Rights Commission, and those domestic courts then actually give their rulings based on those international conventions, if your jurisdiction allows that to happen. In our case, it does. So obviously, we are following that. In Fiji's case, I don't want to sit here and sort of give a stock take of what we have done, wonderful things we've done. Obviously, we ratified the 9 core human rights conventions, and which is very important to us, whether it's ICCPR, ISCRA, etc. So I think, getting back to the sort of main point, we need to be able to ensure that in this sort of evolving world, and I completely agree with His Excellency, that you see a particular momentum now. We were just in a particular session where you had the American convoy, Kerry there. There's a momentum of multilateralism again, and I think we should be able to take advantage of that. I think in going back to getting this opinion, playing a kind of Machiavellian perspective to it, the fact that it won't be legally binding, many states may actually agree to vote for it, because it won't necessarily be legally binding. It will simply be seeking an opinion. So you can, for example, be able to, I'm sure Vanuatu is very good in that diplomacy, that they would be able to maneuver the way and navigate the way to get the numbers at the General Assembly level, with the comfort to some who may be sitting on the fence to say, look, it won't be legally binding on you. For countries like us, obviously, once the opinion comes out, it could be very much used by the courts, because our actually system, our constitution allows for that to be incorporated into development of local jurisprudence. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Long time.
Because Fiji is going to be living in the fifth as well, and I know Vanuatu would like to have this support from other Pacific Island countries. Can we count on Fiji to support the case of the Pacific students fighting for climate change, and Vanuatu to take it forward because they're seen as champions of climate change in the region? So
Yes.
can we count on the country to?
So for the live stream, you're going to be leading the Pacific Island Forum. That's what you said.
We are currently, Fiji is the chair of the Pacific Islands Forum.
Right. That's what you mentioned. And then connecting question.
Well, I'm sure Vanuatu's Prime Minister will raise it at the PIF level. The forum leaders will be meeting, obviously, very soon, and they do meet regularly. And I'm sure that will be raised, and probably be a good idea if the PIFs did, but that's for the leaders to decide.
I don't think. I think it's an ongoing process. Not a hard yes, but very open to discussion.
I mean, look, in anything, if you get regional, support, regional solidarity in that respect, and if it comes from the PIF itself, that's obviously something for the PIF to decide. But it would be good if the PIF leaders do decide to that. It's not within my remit to say what the PIF leaders will say, but I'm sure Vanuatu is going to talk to the leaders forum.
But at least we hope as Fiji is going to give this some space in the island forum as well.
Well, we are here.
Perfect. Is that a satisfying answer for you? Yes. Yeah. Okay. I see a big smile, so that's good. Yes.
So, hi. Now, I really like this initiative, and I've been following it for a time now. We're talking about international law and human rights, but lawyers always say the law is only as good as its enforcement. What would you like out of this advisory opinion? What would you like to mobilize on the ground? Yes, you can say that states may have a responsibility to protect the rights of, future generations and introduce intergenerational equity. But what is it at the end of the day that small island states would like to mobilize on the ground? Is it mitigation? Is it adaptation? Is it accountability? What is it? I have only just a couple of minutes left before I have to run, but I really like your answer.
So how will the advisory opinion result in action on the ground?
Action on the ground. How will
just to
it
summarize,
protect you guys, small island states, protect future generations? What needs to happen? Is it finance, loss and damage? Is it more climate litigation, more cases on the ground, to make sure that there is accountability by state officials or companies across the sea?
Sure. Do you want to go?
Okay.
Look, I mean, I think it depends what you refer. I have not seen the details, but I know that generally the idea is to get an opinion regarding climate change and its impact on human rights, and does it actually breach human rights? That's my general understanding of it. So it depends on the opinion that you get. What you are talking about is both domestic application of that, and also you're talking about international. They both have different implications, and ramifications are also very different. You're delving, of course, in loss and damage in respect of whether it's justiciable, whether it would be able to go to the richer countries or the higher emitters and say, look, guys, you've caused the damage, the loss and damage, we need to be compensated. That's one spectrum of it. Of course, you've also asked about adaptation. I mean, as Vanuatu would tell you, and most small island developing states, and even many other countries like Bangladesh, etc., where they need to invest heavily on adaptation. Our carbon footprint is almost negligible; it's 0.006%. So that does not mean that we don't actually get into the mitigation space. We have, given an undertaking net zero emissions by 2050, 30% reduction by 2030, and we're doing a lot of work in that respect too. However, the fundamental issue for many small island developing states is the ability to afford to be able to adapt, is the ability to afford to build resilience. We have had 13 cyclones since 2016. In 2016, we had a cyclone that reduced the value of our GDP in 36 hours by 1/3. In 36 hours, 1/3 of the GDP is gone. You have to rebuild 225 schools, health centers, etc. So that's another discussion. We can be here for the next 2 hours talking about that, because one of the envelopes that we've been pushing is about accessibility and immediate accessibility to affordable finance. Now, whether it's by way of grant, whether it's by way of subsidized interest rates, we launched green bonds a few years ago. Everybody clapped. Fantastic optics. Interest rates were terrible, 6%. Now, here we are adapting to a particular climatic situation that was not caused by us, but by somebody else, yet we have to pay 6% to be able to adapt. So you fall into this sort of, perennial sort of debt situation. Many countries now talking about, we had a couple other sessions ago, where, in the Caribbean, they're talking about how do we now view debt? I mean, if you are building, for example, to build resilience, if you have 13 cyclones, we have over 5,000 kilometers of electrical cables that went down in the Cyclone Winston. So you have some poor lady who catches fish. She has now access to electricity. Now, because she's in the nether regions of some part of Fiji, it takes 4 months for the electricity cables to be rebuilt to get to her village or to get to her home. In that 4 months, she loses her income. So I would love to be able to get the money to put all the electrical cables underground in Fiji. But it costs literally hundreds of millions of dollars. We want to be able to build resilience for future generations, because if we actually invest in it now, you don't have to do it in the future. And plus, if you invest it in the future, it'll cost you far more than what it would now. So there are many aspects to what you have raised, but I think in terms of getting the opinion, again, it depends on how you want to look at it. In terms of its application domestically, vis-a-vis the state, or whether other private state actors, because you could have, for example, action taken against factories, various developments, etc., development projects. And then, of course, you could use it perhaps, not necessarily in a justiciable manner, but in a moral high authority, that here's the ruling of the ICJ, and you are infringing our rights, what can you do about it?
So even in international context, you have good hopes that this advisory opinion can help states also reach, for example, finance?
Well, one would hope, but one would, again, I think in terms of whether loss and damage has been raised, whether that can actually be used in terms of coming to events such as this, and getting high ambition in terms of climate finance. As we see that we already behind the 100 billion, we now got a mark of 2023. The UK government has asked Germany and Canada to come up with a different model as to how we can achieve the $100 billion. There's now talk about 2025. From 2025, we need $750 billion. to be able to at least meet some of the adaptation and mitigation requirements. So I think, it obviously can be used in various forums and discussions. Some may use it in terms of justiciability. Some, of course, would use it as an opinion that would give them the latitude, if you like, to argue for better, better conditions as far as climate change is concerned.
Ambassador Tefi, do you agree that this is also maybe part of the goal of doing this as the government of Vanuatu, to also maybe assist you in being able to use this internationally?
Well, I mean, if the opinion is given by the court, I mean, if it is linked to human rights, yeah, of course we can use it internationally. For example, the current example, when we talk about disarmament at the United Nations, there was a legal opinion on the consequences of the nuclear on international humanitarian. Yeah, so it's been used, and the countries are quoting this on their statement. It sets a precedent, and you can quote this and use it because it comes from the court. So that's something that you can use at the international level.
Yes, of course, Julia.
Yeah, and also it provides clarity to international affairs.
Yeah, Julia.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that. I think thank you very much for indicating that your countries or your respective countries are willing to take this forward. And I think, again, civil society and youth is also going to utilize that. We want to be an active part of embedding the advisory opinion in what international law is, making sure we can have action also on the ground. So we are expecting it from states, but we're also willing to push for that ourselves. And we want to take responsibility for that as well.
Perfect. We're going to take one more question. Can you hear?
My name is Naima Pepita, and I'm from Hawaii. My question is, do you think Pacific Island judges currently have the capacity or the resources to implement and enforce this advisory opinion in their local courts and deal effectively and efficiently with environmental legal issues that are coming out of this?
Can I repeat the question for the live stream with your screen so I can just read it? Yeah? Where is it? Right. Do you think Pacific judges currently have the capacity or the resources to implement and enforce this advisory opinion in their courts and deal with environmental legal issues? So this is about local capacity. Yes? Okay.
Can I ask you a question? What do you mean by capacity?
Are you talking about money or resources? You mean money, or you mean knowledge, or?
Yeah, I think resources are different to precedents or development jurisprudence, as you would know. I think, of course, like many jurisdictions, both in the developed and developing countries, took on sensitization of the judiciary on gender sensitization. As you know, we've had decisions we made in even developed countries that I would consider to be completely gender insensitive. Yes means no, or no means yes. I mean, a case only about 10 years ago in Australia, one of the judges in one of the I think it was the district courts actually made that comment. So I think it's awareness, sensitization of environmental issues, I think, is obviously needed all across the globe. I mean, I can go to various developed countries where, say, some judges simply won't be able to draw the linkages between human rights and climate change whatsoever, because there are many climate denials in the developed world also. So I think it's not just simply a question about Pacific Island countries, but I think certainly in terms of resources per se, where you have specialized courts, So you may be referring to, so for example, environmental courts. So environmental courts, are a different kettle of fish in respect to, I would say, in the overall climate change the development of jurisprudence, because there's quite a lot of jurisprudence regarding, regarding environmental issues. So you have specific legislation, what you can do, what you cannot do in terms of cutting down trees. We recently had a successful prosecution, as you would know, in Fiji, where a developer had over-exceeded the requirements set by the Ministry of Environment, and the Ministry of Environment actually took that developer to court, and there was a successful prosecution. And I think in the long term, one of the areas that perhaps could be looked at, whether you have special prosecutorial agencies regarding environment. And I think the reality is that many Pacific Island countries, again, as you would know, seeing that you're doing the study, is that many Pacific Island countries are very small jurisdictions with limited resources. So you cannot go off and set up all these different courts because it requires funding on a sustainable basis. If you have island countries that are basically finding it very difficult to sustain communities where the inundation of water is taking place, and they have to put up seawalls and various other nature-based solutions, and then do they set up a separate environmental code, or do they save these communities? We have 43 communities that need to be relocated to higher ground. We've already relocated 6 communities. And that in itself is a huge exercise. So we set up a relocation trust fund. So I think, yes, I mean, the awareness around environment is critically important. But I think we should not run away with this idea of having all this specialization, because you have to make sure that there's sustainability built into that. The fact that that developer was successfully prosecuted, I think, was a landmark decision in itself. It was at the magistrate's court level. You had the normal director of public prosecutions who deals in murder, rape, burglary, theft, now prosecuting for environmental purposes. In some jurisdictions, that would be actually, rather peculiar to do that. You would have specialist prosecutors. So I think we need to look at those sort of areas. But I think in respect of development of jurisprudence, of course, these are new laws. The jurisprudence will develop. One of the sad things I find that in not just in the Pacific, but many other countries, as we found, for example, simply in the development of jurisprudence of human rights per se, is the inability of the lawyers in the private sector, legal practitioners, wanting to take up these cases. All right. That's, I think, is very important. They don't actually take up these cases. So if you don't have referrals to these courts, how can you develop the jurisprudence?
Satisfied? All right. Good, because we don't have time anymore. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. This was our event. I think there should be one call to action from Jule. As coming from the youth, there's a few young people here that are not involved yet. What if they want to get involved?
Then join us, please, on all the social medias, the website. Young people and also not so young people anymore. And we need everyone's contribution, I think.
And then there's also some people from various governments. Let's say we don't want to draw this distinction, youth and adults.
The reason why I say that, I agree with you, because 70% of our population is below the age of 40. So they are the ones who are actually in the steering house, if you like.
Completely agree. Yeah. But just to give Ambassador TV one more chance. If there is any government officials here, can they come talk to you?
They are free to talk to me if they want to, but at the moment it's an issue that I'll have to talk with my friends at the UN.
We don't want to get you in trouble. That's okay. But talk to him. Thank you so much for being here. I hope it was very engaging and you learned a lot. And hopefully by next year you'll see something like UN passes advisory opinion on climate justice and human rights. Thank you so much, Excellencies, for being here, allowing us to use some of your time, precious time, I should say. I think it was amazing, very knowledgeable insights. I learned stuff, at least. So that's a good thing. So thank you for that. We have a small present here. And my favorite contribution is my own, of course. It's stroopwafels from the Netherlands. So this is for you.
Thank you.
Also some other things, but the stroopwafels, really, they rock. No. Okay. I'm so sorry. We should have gotten gluten-free stroopwafels. Okay, well, that's me.